Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about published in 1923 in the Strand magazine and the Pictorial Review. Poor Millicent Bracegirdle, sent by her brother, the Dean of the Parishioners, who has never been out of England before, finds herself locked in a man's room after using the hotel's shower facilities in Paris, France late at night. One had only to glance at little Millicent Bracegirdle to see that in her were epitomized all the virtues and ideals of Easingstoke. What is she to do? Miss Bracegirdle does her duty. This is the room, madam. Ah, thank you, thank you. Does it appear satisfactory to madam? Oh, yes. Thank you, quite. Does madam require anything further? If not too late, may I have a hot bath? Parfaitement, madam. The bathroom is at the end of the passage on the left. I will go and prepare it for madam. There is one thing more. I have had a very long journey. I am very tired. Will you please see that I am not disturbed in the morning until I ring? Certainly, madam. Millicent Bracegirdle was speaking the truth. She was tired. But then, in the sleepy cathedral town of Easingstoke, from which she came, it was customary for everyone to speak the truth. It was customary, moreover, for everyone to lead simple, self-denying lives, to give up their time to good works and elevating thoughts. One had only to glance at little Miss Bracegirdle to see that in her were epitomized all the virtues and ideals of Easingstoke. Indeed, it was the pursuit of duty which had brought her to the Hotel de l'Ouest at Bordeaux on this summer's night. She had travelled from Easingstoke to London, then without a break to Dover, crossed that horrid stretch of sea to Calais, entrained for Paris, where of necessity she had to spend 4 hours, a terrifying experience, and then had come on to Bordeaux, arriving at midnight. The reason of this journey being that someone had to come to Bordeaux to meet her young sister-in-law, who was arriving the next day from South America. The sister-in-law was married to a missionary in Paraguay, but the climate not agreeing with her, she was returning to England. Her dear brother, the Dean, would have come himself, but the claims on his time were so extensive, the parishioners would miss him, so it was clearly Millicent's duty to go. She had never been out of England before, and she had a horror of travel, and an ingrained distrust of foreigners. She spoke a little French, sufficient for the purpose of travel and for obtaining any modest necessities, but not sufficient for carrying on any kind of conversation. She did not deplore this latter fact, for she was of opinion that French people were not the kind of people that one would naturally want to have conversation with. Broadly speaking, they were not quite nice, in spite of their ingratiating manners. She unpacked her valise, placed her things about the room, tried to thrust back the little stabs of homesickness as she visualized her darling room at the deanery. How strange and hard and unfriendly seemed these foreign hotel bedrooms. No chintz and lavender and photographs of all the dear family, the Dean, the nephews and nieces, the interior of the cathedral during Harvest Festival, no samplers and needlework or colored reproductions of the paintings by Marcus Stone. Oh, dear, how foolish she was. What did she expect? She disrobed, and donned a dressing gown, then, armed with a sponge bag and towel, she crept timidly down the passage to the bathroom, after closing her bedroom door and turning out the light. The gay bathroom cheered her. She wallowed luxuriously in the hot water, regarding her slim legs with quiet satisfaction. And for the first time since leaving home there came to her a pleasant moment, a sense of enjoyment in her adventure. And after all, it was rather an adventure, and her life had been peculiarly devoid of it. What queer lives some people must live, traveling about, having experiences. How old was she? Not really old, not by any means. 42? 43? She had shut herself up so. She hardly ever regarded the potentialities of age. As the world went, she was a well-preserved woman for her age. A life of self-abnegation, simple living, healthy walking, and fresh air had kept her younger than these hurrying, pampered, city people. Love? Yes, once when she was a young girl, he was a schoolmaster, a most estimable, kind gentleman. They were never engaged, not actually, but it was a kind of understood thing. For 3 years it went on, this pleasant understanding and friendship. He was so gentle, so distinguished and considerate. She would have been happy to have continued in this strain forever. But there was something lacking. Stephen had curious restless lapses. From the physical aspect of marriage she shrank, yes, even with Stephen, who was gentleness and kindness itself. And then, one day he went away, vanished, and never returned. They told her he had married one of the country girls, a girl who used to work in Mrs. Forbes's dairy, not a very nice girl, she feared, one of those fast, pretty, foolish women. Hi-oh. Well, she had lived that down, destructive as the blow appeared at the time. One lives everything down in time. There is always work, living for others, faith, duty. At the same time she could sympathize with people who found satisfaction in unusual experiences. There would be lots to tell the dear Dean when she wrote to him on the morrow, nearly losing her spectacles on the restaurant car, the amusing remarks of an American child on the train to Paris, the curious food everywhere, nothing simple and plain, the 2 English ladies at the hotel in Paris who told her about the death of their uncle, the poor man being taken ill on Friday and dying on Sunday afternoon, just before tea time, the kindness of the hotel proprietor, who had sat up for her, the prettiness of the chambermaid. Oh, yes, everyone was really very kind. The French people, after all, were very nice. She had seen nothing but what was quite nice and decorous. There would be lots to tell the Dean tomorrow. Her body glowed with the friction of the towel. She again donned her night attire and her thick woolen dressing gown. She tidied up the bathroom carefully in exactly the same way she was accustomed to do at home, then once more gripped her sponge bag and towel, and turning out the light she crept down the passage to her room. Entering the room, she switched on the light and shut the door quickly. Then one of those ridiculous things happened, just the kind of thing you would expect to happen in a foreign hotel. The handle of a door came off in her hand. She ejaculated a quiet bother, and sought to replace it with one hand, the other being occupied with the towel and sponge bag. In doing this she behaved foolishly, for, thrusting the knob carelessly against the steel pin without properly securing it, she only succeeded in pushing the pin farther into the door, and the knob was not adjusted. She uttered another little bother, and put her sponge bag and towel down on the floor. She then tried to recover the pin with her left hand, but it had gone in too far. How very foolish, she thought. I shall have to ring for the chambermaid, and perhaps the poor girl has gone to bed. She turned and faced the room, and suddenly the awful horror was upon her. There was a man asleep in her bed. The sight of that swarthy face on the pillow, with its black tousled hair and heavy moustache, produced in her the most terrible moment of her life. Her heart nearly stopped. For some seconds she could neither think nor scream, and her first thought was, I mustn't scream. She stood there like one paralyzed, staring at the man's head and the great curved hunch of his body under the clothes. When she began to think she thought very quickly and all her thoughts worked together. The first vivid realization was that it wasn't the man's fault, it was her fault. She was in the wrong room. It was the man's room. The rooms were identical, but there were all his things about, his clothes thrown carelessly over chairs, his collar and tie on the wardrobe, his great heavy boots and the strange yellow trunk. She must get out, somehow, anyhow. She clutched once more at the door, feverishly driving her fingernails into the hole where the elusive pin had vanished. She tried to force her fingers in the crack and open the door that way, but it was of no avail. She was to all intents and purposes locked in a bedroom in a strange hotel, alone with a man, a foreigner, a Frenchman. She must think as she switched off the light. If the light was off he might not wake up. It might give her time to think how to act. It was surprising that he had not awakened. If he did wake up, what would he do? How could she explain herself? He wouldn't believe her. No one would believe her. In an English hotel it would be difficult enough, but here, where she wasn't known, where they were all foreigners and consequently antagonistic, merciful heavens. She must get out. Should she wake the man? No, she couldn't do that. He might murder her. He might. Oh, it was too awful to contemplate. Should she scream? Ring for the chambermaid? But no, it would be the same thing. People would come rushing. They would find her there in the strange man's bedroom after midnight, she, Millicent Bracegirdle, sister of the Dean of Easingstoke. Easingstoke. Visions of Easingstoke flashed through her alarmed mind. Visions of the news arriving, women whispering around tea tables, "Have you heard, my dear? Really, no one would have imagined. Her poor brother. He will, of course, have to resign, you know, my dear. Have a little more cream, my love." Would they put her in prison? She might be in the room for the purpose of stealing, or she might be in the room for the purpose of breaking every one of the 10 Commandments. There was no explaining it away. She was a ruined woman, suddenly and irretrievably, unless she could open a door. The chimney? Should she climb up the chimney? But where would that lead to? And then she thought of the man pulling her down by the legs when she was already smothered in soot. Any moment he might wake up. She thought she heard the chambermaid going along the passage. If she had wanted to scream, she ought to have screamed before. The maid would know she had left the bathroom some minutes ago. Was she going to her room? An abrupt and desperate plan formed in her mind. It was already getting on for 1 o'clock. The man was probably a quite harmless commercial traveler or businessman. He would probably get up about 7 or 8 o'clock, dress quickly, and go out. She would hide under his bed until he went. Only a matter of a few hours. Men don't look under their beds, although she made a religious practice of doing so herself. When he went, he would be sure to open the door all right. The handle would be lying on the floor as though it had dropped off in the night. He would probably ring for the chambermaid, or open it with a penknife. Men are so clever at those things. When he had gone, she would creep out and steal back to her room, and then there would be no necessity to give any explanation to anyone. But heavens! What an experience! Once under the white frill of that bed, she would be safe till the morning. In daylight nothing seemed so terrifying. With feline precaution she went down on her hands and knees and crept towards the bed. What a lucky thing there was that broad white frill. She lifted it at the foot of the bed and crept under. There was just sufficient depth to take her slim body. The floor was fortunately carpeted all over, but it seemed very close and dusty. Suppose she coughed or sneezed? Anything might happen. Of course, it would be much more difficult to explain her presence under the bed than to explain her presence just inside the door. She held her breath in suspense. No sound came from above, but under the frill it was difficult to hear anything. It was almost more nerve-wracking than hearing everything, listening for signs and portents. This temporary escape, in any case, would give her time to regard the predicament detachedly. Up to the present she had not been able to focus the full significance of her action. She had, in truth, lost her head. She had been like a wild animal, consumed with the sole idea of escape. A mouse or a cat would do this kind of thing, take cover and lie low. If only it hadn't all happened abroad. She tried to frame sentences of explanation in French, but French escaped her. And then they talked so rapidly, these people. They didn't listen. The situation was intolerable. Would she be able to endure a night of it? At present she was not altogether uncomfortable, only stuffy and, very, very frightened. But she had to face 6 or 7 or 8 hours of it, and perhaps even then discovery in the end. The minutes flashed by as she turned the matter over and over in her head. There was no solution. She began to wish she had screamed or awakened the man. She saw now that that would have been the wisest and most politic thing to do, but she had allowed 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour to elapse from the moment when the chambermaid would know that she had left the bathroom. They would want an explanation of what she had been doing in the man's bedroom all that time. Why hadn't she screamed before? She lifted the frill an inch or two and listened. She thought she heard the man breathing, but she couldn't be sure. In any case, it gave her more air. She became a little bolder, and thrust her face partly through the frill so that she could breathe freely. She tried to steady her nerves by concentrating on the fact that, well, there it was. She had done it. She must make the best of it. Perhaps it would be all right, after all. Of course, I shan't sleep, she kept on thinking. I shan't be able to. In any case, it will be safer not to sleep. I must be on the watch. She set her teeth and waited grimly. Now that she had made up her mind to see the thing through in this manner, she felt a little calmer. She almost smiled as she reflected that there would certainly be something to tell the dear Dean when she wrote to him tomorrow. How would he take it? Of course he would believe it. He had never doubted a single word that she had uttered in her life, but the story would sound so preposterous. In Easingstoke it would be almost impossible to imagine such an experience. She, Millicent Bracegirdle, spending a night under a strange man's bed in a foreign hotel. What would those women think? Fanny Shields and that garrulous old Mrs. Rusbridger? Perhaps, yes, Perhaps it would be advisable to tell the dear Dean to let the story go no further. One could hardly expect Mrs. Rusbridger to not make implications, exaggerate. Oh, dear, what were they all doing now? They would all be asleep, everyone in Easingstoke. Her dear brother always retired at 10:15. He would be sleeping calmly and placidly, the sleep of the just, breathing the clear sweet air of Sussex. Not this. Oh, it was stuffy. She felt a great desire to cough. She mustn't do that. Yes, at 9:30 all the servants were summoned to the library. There was a short service, never more than 15 minutes. Her brother didn't believe in a great deal of ritual. Then at 10 o'clock cocoa for everyone. At 10:15 bed for everyone. The dear, sweet bedroom, with the narrow white bed, by the side of which she had knelt every night so long as she could remember, even in her dear mother's day, and said her prayers. Prayers. Yes, that was a curious thing. This was the first night in her life experience when she had not said her prayers on retiring. The situation was certainly very peculiar, exceptional, one might call it. God would understand and forgive such a lapse. And yet, after all, why, what was to prevent her saying her prayers? Of course, she couldn't kneel in the proper devotional attitude. That would be a physical impossibility. Nevertheless, perhaps her prayers might be just as efficacious, if they came from the heart. So little Miss Bracegirdle curved her body and placed her hands in a devout attitude in front of her face, and quite inaudibly murmured her prayers under the strange man's bed. At the end she added, fervently, "Please God protect me from the dangers and perils of this night." Then she lay silent and inert, strangely soothed by the effort of praying. It began to get very uncomfortable, stuffy, but at the same time draughty, and the floor was getting harder every minute. She changed her position stealthily and controlled her desire to cough. Her heart was beating rapidly. Over and over again recurred the vivid impression of every little incident and argument that had occurred to her from the moment she left the bathroom. This must, of course, be the room next to her own. So confusing, with perhaps 20 bedrooms all exactly alike on one side of a passage carrot. How was one to remember whether one's number was 115 or 116? Her mind began to wander idly into her schooldays. She was always very bad at figures. She disliked Euclid and all those subjects about angles and equations, so unimportant, not leading anywhere. History she liked, and botany, and reading about strange foreign lands, although she had always been too timid to visit them. And the lives of great people, most fascinating: Oliver Cromwell, Lord Beaconsfield, Lincoln, Grace Darling. There was a heroine for you, General Booth, a great, good man, even if a little vulgar. She remembered dear old Miss Trimmings talking about him one afternoon at the Vicar of Street bride's garden party. She was so amusing. Good heavens! Almost unwittingly Millicent Bracegirdle had emitted a violent sneeze. It was finished. For the second time that night she was conscious of her heart nearly stopping. For the second time that night she was so paralyzed with fear that her mentality went to pieces. Now she would hear the man get out of bed. He would walk across to the door, switch on the light, and then lift up the frill. She could almost see that fierce mustachioed face glaring at her and growling something in French. Then he would thrust out an arm and drag her out. And then? Oh God in heaven! What then? I shall scream before he does it. Perhaps I had better scream now. If he drags me out he will clap his hand over my mouth. Perhaps chloroform. But somehow she could not scream. She was too frightened even for that. She lifted the frill and listened. Was he moving stealthily across the carpet? She thought, no, she couldn't be sure. Anything might be happening. He might strike her from above, with one of those heavy boots, perhaps. Nothing seemed to be happening, but the suspense was intolerable. She realized now that she hadn't the power to endure a night of it. Anything would be better than this: disgrace, imprisonment, even death. She would crawl out, wake the man, and try to explain as best she could. She would switch on the light, cough, and say, "Monsieur." Then he would start up and stare at her. Then she would say, what should she say? "Pardon, monsieur, mais je what on earth was the French for I have made a mistake? J'ai tort, c'est la chambre, incorrect. Voulez-vous, What was the French for doorknob? Let me go." It didn't matter. She would turn on the light, cough, and trust to luck. If he got out of bed and came towards her, she would scream the hotel down. The resolution formed, she crawled deliberately out at the foot of the bed. She scrambled hastily towards the door, a perilous journey. In a few seconds the room was flooded with light. She turned towards the bed, coughed, and cried out boldly, "Monsieur." Then for the third time that night little Miss Bracegirdle's heart all but stopped. In this case the climax of the horror took longer to develop, but when it was reached it clouded the other two experiences into insignificance. The man on the bed was dead. She had never beheld death before, but one does not mistake death. She stared at him, bewildered, and repeated almost in a whisper, "Monsieur, monsieur." Then she tiptoed towards the bed. The hair and moustache looked extraordinarily black in that grey, wax-like setting. The mouth was slightly open, and the face, which in life might have been vicious and sensual, looked incredibly peaceful and far away. It was as though she were regarding the features of a man across some vast passage of time, a being who had always been completely remote from mundane preoccupations. When the full truth came home to her, little Miss Bracegirdle buried her face in her hands and murmured, "Poor fellow, poor fellow." For the moment her own position seemed an affair of small consequence. She was in the presence of something greater and more all-pervading. Almost instinctively she knelt by the bed and prayed. For a few moments she seemed to be possessed by an extraordinary calmness and detachment. The burden of our hotel predicament was a gossamer trouble, a silly, trivial, almost comic episode, something that could be explained away. But this man, he had lived his life, whatever it was like, and now he was in the presence of his Maker. What kind of man had he been? Her meditations were broken by an abrupt sound. It was that of a pair of heavy boots being thrown down by the door outside. She started, thinking at first it was someone knocking or trying to get in. She heard the boots, however, stumping away down the corridor, and the realization stabbed her with the truth of her own position. She mustn't stop there. The necessity to get out was even more urgent. To be found in a strange man's bedroom in the night is bad enough, but to be found in a dead man's bedroom was even worse. They would accuse her of murder, perhaps. Yes, that would be it. How could she possibly explain to these foreigners? Good God! They would hang her. No, guillotine her, that's what they do in France. They would chop her head off with a great steel knife. Merciful heavens! She envisaged herself standing blindfold, by a priest and an executioner in a red cap, like that man in the Dickens story. What was his name? Sidney Carton, that was it. And before he went on the scaffold he said, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done." But no, she couldn't say that. It would be a far, far worse thing that she did. What about the dear Dean, her sister-in-law arriving alone from Paraguay tomorrow, all her dear people and friends in Easingstoke, her darling Tony, the large grey tabby cat? It was her duty not to have her head chopped off if it could possibly be avoided. She could do no good in the room. She could not recall the dead to life. Her only mission was to escape. Any minute people might arrive. The chambermaid, the boots, the manager, the gendarmes. Visions of gendarmes arriving armed with swords and notebooks vitalized her almost exhausted energies. She was a desperate woman. Fortunately now she had not to worry about the light. She sprang once more at the door and tried to force it open with her fingers. The result hurt her and gave her pause. If she was to escape she must think, and think intensely. She mustn't do anything rash and silly, she must just think and plan calmly. She examined the lock carefully. There was no keyhole, but there was a slip bolt, so that the hotel guest could lock the door on the inside, but it couldn't be locked on the outside. Oh, why didn't this poor dear dead man lock his door last night? Then this trouble could not have happened. She could see the end of the steel pin. It was about half an inch down the hole. If anyone was passing they must surely notice the handle sticking out too far the other side. She drew a hairpin out of her hair and tried to coax the pin back, but she only succeeded in pushing it a little farther in. She felt the color leaving her face and a strange feeling of faintness came over her. She was fighting for her life, she mustn't give way. She darted round the room like an animal in a trap, her mind alert for the slightest crevice of escape. The window had no balcony, and there was a drop of 5 stories to the street below. Dawn was breaking. Soon the activities of the hotel and the city would begin. The thing must be accomplished before then. She went back once more and stared hard at the lock. She stared at the dead man's property, his razors and brushes and writing materials. He appeared to have a lot of writing materials, pens and pencils and rubber and sealing wax. Sealing wax. Necessity is truly the mother of invention. It is in any case quite certain that Millicent Bracegirdle, who had never invented a thing in her life, would never have evolved the ingenious little device she did, had she not believed that her position was utterly desperate. For in the end this is what she did. She got together a box of matches, a candle, a bar of sealing wax, and a hairpin. She made a little pool of hot sealing wax, into which she dipped the end of the hairpin. Collecting a small blob on the end of it, she thrust it into the hole, and let it adhere to the end of the steel pin. At the 7th attempt she got the thing to move. It took her just an hour and 10 minutes to get that steel pin back into the room, and when at length it came far enough through for her to grip it with her fingernails, she burst into tears through the sheer physical tenseness of the strain. Very, very carefully she pulled it through, and holding it firmly with her left hand she fixed the knob with her right, then slowly turned it. The door opened. The temptation to dash out into the corridor and scream with relief was almost irresistible, but she forbore. She listened. She peeped out. No one was about. With beating heart she went out, closing the door inaudibly. She crept like a little mouse to the room next door, stole in, and flung herself on the bed. Immediately she did so, it flashed through her mind that she had left her sponge bag and towel in the dead man's room. In looking back upon her experience she always considered that that second expedition was the worst of all. She might have left the sponge bag and towel remain there, only that the towel, she never used hotel towels, had neatly inscribed in the comma M.B. With furtive caution she managed to retrace her steps. She re-entered the dead man's room, reclaimed her property, and returned to her own. When the mission was accomplished she was indeed well nigh spent. She lay on her bed and groaned feebly. At last she fell into a fevered sleep. It was 11 o'clock when she awoke, and no one had been to disturb her. The sun was shining, and the experiences of the night appeared a dubious nightmare. Surely she had dreamt it all? With dread still burning in her heart she rang the bell. After a short interval of time the chambermaid appeared. The girl's eyes were bright with some uncontrollable excitement. No, she had not been dreaming. This girl had heard something. "Will you bring some tea, please?" "Certainly, madam." The maid drew back the curtains and fussed about the room. She was under a pledge of secrecy, but she could contain herself no longer. Suddenly she approached the bed, and whispered, excitedly, "Oh, madame, I am promised not to tell, but a terrible thing has happened. A man, a dead man, has been found in room 117, a guest. Please not to say I tell you. But they have all been here, the gendarmes, the doctors, the inspectors. Oh, it is terrible, terrible." The little lady in the bed said nothing. There was indeed nothing to say. But Marie-Louise Lancret was too full of emotional excitement to spare her. "But the terrible thing is, do you know who he was, madam? They say it is Boldu, the man wanted for the murder of Jeanne Carton in the Bam at Vincennes. They say he strangled her, and then cut her up in pieces and hid her in 2 barrels, which he threw into the river. Oh, but he was a bad man, madam, a terrible bad man, and he died in the room next door. Suicide, they think, or was it an attack of the heart, remorse, some shock, perhaps? Did you say a café complete, madam?" "No, thank you, my dear, just a cup of tea, strong tea." "Parfaitement, madam." The girl retired, and a little later a waiter entered the room with a tray of tea. She could never get over her surprise at this. It seemed so, well, indecorous for a man, although only a waiter, to enter a lady's bedroom. There was, no doubt, a great deal in what the dear Dean said. They were certainly very peculiar, these French people. They had most peculiar notions. It was not the way they behaved at Basingstoke. She got farther under the sheets, but the waiter appeared quite indifferent to the situation. He put the tray down and retired. When he had gone, she sat up and sipped her tea, which gradually warmed her. She was glad the sun was shining. She would have to get up soon. They said that her sister-in-law's boat was due to berth at 1 o'clock. That would give her time to dress comfortably, write to her brother, and then go down to the docks. Poor man. So he had been a murderer, a man who cut up the bodies of his victims, and she had spent the night in his bedroom. They were certainly a most, how could she describe it? People. Nevertheless she felt a little glad that at the end she had been there to kneel and pray by his bedside. Probably nobody else had ever done that. It was very difficult to judge people. Something at some time might have gone wrong. He might not have murdered the woman after all. People were often wrongly convicted. She herself. If the police had found her in that room at 3 o'clock that morning, it is that which takes place in the heart which counts. One learns and learns. Had she not learned that one can pray just as effectively lying under a bed as kneeling beside it? Poor man. She washed and dressed herself and walked calmly down to the writing room. There was no evidence of excitement among the other hotel guests. Probably none of them knew about the tragedy except herself. She went to a writing table, and after profound meditation wrote as follows. My dear brother. I arrived late last night, after a very pleasant journey. Everyone was very kind and attentive. The manager was sitting up for me. I nearly lost my spectacles in the restaurant car, but a kind old gentleman found them and returned them to me. There was a most amusing American child on the train. I will tell you about her on my return. The people are very pleasant, but the food is peculiar, nothing plain and wholesome. I am going down to meet Annie at 1 o'clock. How have you been keeping, my dear? I hope you have not had any further return of the bronchial attacks. Please tell Lizzie that I remembered in the train on the way here that large stone jar of marmalade that Mrs. Hunt made is behind those empty tins on the top shelf of the cupboard next to the coach house. I wonder whether Mrs. Buller was able to come to Easingstoke after all. This is a nice hotel, but I think Annie and I will stay at the Grand tonight, as the bedrooms here are rather noisy. Well, my dear, nothing more till I return. Do take care of yourself. Your loving sister, Millicent. Yes, she couldn't tell Peter about it, neither in the letter nor when she went back to him. It was her duty not to tell him. It would only distress him. She felt convinced of it. In this curious foreign atmosphere the thing appeared possible, but in Easingstoke the mere accounting of the fantastic situation would be positively indelicate. There was no escaping that broad general fact: she had spent a night in a strange man's bedroom. Whether he was a gentleman or a criminal, even whether he was dead or alive, did not seem to mitigate the jar upon her sensibilities, or, rather it would not mitigate the jar upon the peculiarly sensitive relationship between her brother and herself. To say that she had been to the bathroom, the knob of the door handle came off in her hand, she was too frightened to awaken the sleeper or scream, she got under the bed. Well, it was all perfectly true. Peter would believe her, but one simply could not conceive such a situation in Easingstoke Deanery. It would create a curious little barrier between them, as though she had been dipped in some mysterious solution which alienated her. It was her duty not to tell. She put on her hat and went out to post the letter. She distrusted a hotel letterbox. One never knew who handled these letters. It was not a proper official way of treating them. She walked to the head post office in Bordeaux. The sun was shining. It was very pleasant walking about amongst these queer, excitable people, so foreign and different looking, and the cafes already crowded with chattering men and women, and the flower stalls, and the strange odor of, what was it? Salt? Brine? Charcoal? A military band was playing in the square, very gay and moving. It was all life, and movement, and bustle, thrilling rather. I spent a night in a strange man's bedroom. Little Miss Bracegirdle hunched her shoulders, hummed to herself, and walked faster. She reached the post office, and found the large metal plate with a slot for letters and R.F. stamped above it. Something official at last. Her face was a little flushed. Was it the warmth of the day, or the contact of movement and life? As she put her letter into the slot. After posting it she put her hand into the slot and flicked it round to see that there were no foreign contraptions to impede its safe delivery. No, the letter had dropped safely in. She sighed contentedly, and walked off in the direction of the docks to meet her sister-in-law from Paraguay. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists go to pixabay.com. Sheila.